Right. Experimental philosophy is a relatively recent movement that questions the supposedly traditional philosophical methodology. Now, traditional philosophers, at least according to what experimentalists tell us, reason entirely a priori and use exclusively their own judgments to determine whether the consequences of the principles they defend or attack are intuitively correct. And they do so usually via mental experiments in which they try to gauge what, according to the principles in question, one would have to say in the conditions described in the hypothetical scenario. Now, experimental philosophers, on the other hand, advocate the collection of data through surveys that elicit the intuitive judgments of subjects, philosophers and non-philosophers alike, in order to test the adequacy of theoretical principles of claims. Now, whereas the input of philosophical theorizing for the traditional philosopher are, at least according to the experimentalist, his own intuitions, the experimental philosopher relies on the intuitions of a much wider segment of the population. Now, what experimental philosophers tell us is that traditional philosophers theorize, so to speak, from the armchair. And experimental philosophers, and that's a quote from a blog called Experimental Philosophy, where they have their manifesto, so to speak. They say experimental philosophers actually go out and run systematic experiments aimed at understanding how people ordinarily think about the issues at the foundation of the philosophical discussion. Now, the impact of the new movement has been quite strong, and some philosophers have seen in it the death sentence for a common but outdated way of doing philosophy. This is what Eric Schwitzgebel says in his blog, The Splintered Mind. He says, a priori armchair philosophy is thus in an awkward position. The 20th century justification for analytic philosophy as a distinct a priori discipline appears to be collapsing. It's clear that psychology and linguistics will soon be able, perhaps already can, analyze our philosophical concepts and language better than armchair philosophers. Now, as you see, that the armchair things plays a big role. Now, this has generated an intense debate and a lot of literature discussing the role of intuitions in philosophy, whose intuitions count, and why. Now, that's an interesting debate, but the focus of my discussion here lies elsewhere. I must confess that it seems to me that the debate on the role of intuitions, the status of intuitions, and whose intuitions count, it's a non-issue. I don't think that the relevant questions are about intuitions. They're about our judgments on theories. But anyway, let me put this aside. I'm just going to focus directly on something else. Now, my purpose is to discuss recent proposals by experimental philosophers based on data that seem to indicate that the semantic intuitions on which philosophers have relied when discussing the theory of reference, and in particular the semantics of proper names and other singular terms, are not universal, since there appear to be wide differences, both cross-cultural and intracultural, in judgments about reference. Now, I will contend that the tests conducted by experimentalists do not elicit the kind of data that could have an impact in the theory of reference, and that they are thus irrelevant for semantic theorizing. Now, so my plan here is the following. First, I will focus on a rather well-known result by Edouard Machery, Ron Mallons, Sean Nichols, and Stephen Stitch, a paper that they published in Cognition in 2004, and I will discuss my concerns about their conclusions, some of which I expressed in a paper that appeared in Analysis in 2009. Now, Machery, Olivola, and Blanc subsequently published the results of a new study that was designed to address those worries that I had expressed. And I will discuss the results of the new study and argue that the original concerns still stand. And I will conclude with a reflection on the kind of data semantic theory needs to rely on, and discussing whether and in what way semanticists should update their methodology. So let's talk about let's first give a little bit of background. Now, remember that classical descriptivism about the semantics of names contends that the reference of a proper name is determined by an associated definite description. The kinds of descriptions classical descriptivists, such as Russell, and according at least to some interpretations, Frege, took to be associated with proper names are standard, run-of-the-mill descriptions, just such as the philosopher who tutored Alexander the Great, or the Roman orator who denounced Catiline. Now, the idea is when speakers use names, such as Aristotle or Cicero, they refer to whoever satisfies the associated description. That's classical descriptivism. Now, the conception of what determines the connection between a name and its reference that was postulated by classical descriptivism was almost unanimously abandoned after 1970, as most semanticists embraced a new paradigm based on the causal historical picture of the determination of reference proposed by Kripke and by Donnellan. Now, according to the causal historical picture, a speaker refers when she uses a name because she's part of a chain of communication that connects her use to previous uses, leading all the way back to the introduction of the name and thus to the referent. Descriptions such as the philosopher that tutored Alexander the Great, that the speaker may well associate with the name, play perhaps a role in cognitive life. Explained psychologically, they may explain a lot of things. But they do not determine who the agent is referring when they use Aristotle. Now, Kripke and Donnellan presented separately a number of arguments against classical descriptivism, but two of those, one of them in particular, are especially powerful. First, they observed that the descriptive information speakers attach to proper names is oftentimes insufficient to single out a unique individual as referent. For instance, speakers use Cicero, even if all the information they file under the name is Roman orator. Now, there were many Roman orators. Now, still, Kripke and Donnellan contend those speakers refer to Cicero when they use the name Cicero, and so they do refer to the pairs of names they use in spite of their ignorance and of uniquely identifying information. Second, and this argument is especially important for our purposes here, they also observe that the description that speakers attach to a name may be satisfied by an object that intuitively is not the referent. For many people, Einstein was the inventor of the atomic bomb, but when they use Einstein, they refer to Einstein and not to some physicists like Oppenheimer, perhaps, in the Manhattan Project. So the idea is that speakers refer to the right referent even when the information they attach to the name is in error. And this came to be known as the error argument. Now, the intuitions elicited by the ignorance and error arguments are supposed to enjoy universal acceptance. But the data presented by Machery and colleagues in their 2004 paper cast some doubt on the alleged universality of the intuitions. According to Machery and colleagues, some groups of speakers have descriptivist intuitions when exposed to error-type arguments. Machery's conclusion is indeed surprising because even contemporary descriptivists are not trying to revive classical descriptivism and have postulated considerably more sophisticated descriptions as the reference fixers associated with names, typically descriptions that do not jeopardize the role of a causal historical chain of communication. I'm thinking here about Kroon's proposal, which is based on an idea of David Lewis, according to which the description is something that refers to the causal chain of communication that leads back to the speaker, to the referent. Now, but this situation may be due, if Machery and colleagues are right, to the fact that the debate in the theory of reference is practically dominated by Western or Western-educated philosophers. For as they contend, their data shows that East Asians are, unlike Westerners, more inclined to fall in line with the predictions of descriptivism as regards reference, whereas Westerners report intuitions that are more consistent with the causal historical picture. Now, the inspiration that led Machery and colleagues to the hypothesis that East Asians would be less inclined than Westerners towards the causal historical picture derives from work in cultural psychology from Richard Nisbet and his colleagues, Nisbet, Peng, Choi, and Norenzayan. Now, according to Nisbet, there are substantial and systematic cognitive differences between East Asians and Westerners. In particular, and this is a quote from Machery's and colleagues' paper about what Nisbet says. The cross-cultural work indicates that East Asians are more inclined than Westerners to make categorical judgments on the basis of similarity. Westerners, on the other hand, are more disposed to focus on causation in describing the world and classifying things. This differential focus led us to hypothesize that there might be a related cross-cultural difference in semantic intuitions. Now, there's an issue prior of the discussion of their results that I want to mention here. Now, I think that the reliance of Machery and colleagues' hypothesis on Nisbet's results is rather puzzling. For two reasons, at least. First of all, it's just not clear how causal the causal historical picture is. As presented by Kripke and Donnellan, it's causal pretty much by name only. The causal historical picture that Kripke and Donnellan present is essentially a story about the transmission and preservation of meaning, applicable to any word in the language, not just names. In fact, Kripke himself, in Naming a Necessity, does not stress the causal factor. And he often uses expressions such as historical chain, causal chain of communications with causal in quotes, and quite simply, chain of communication. And Donnellan, while stressing the importance of the role of history and elaborating how our uses of names are parasitic on other people's usage, uses the word causal with caution. This is what he says in the 1970 paper, Proper Names and Identifying Descriptions. He says, "It seems clear to me that in some way the referent must be historically, or we might say causally connected to the speech act. But I do not see my way clear to saying exactly how in general that connection goes. Perhaps there's no exact theory." Now, Machery and colleagues' own presentation of the causal historical picture affords little role to causation. This is what they say. This is the way they present. Machery himself present the causal historical picture. They say, a name is introduced into a linguistic community for the purpose of referring to an individual. It continues to refer to that individual as long as its users are linked to the individual via a causal chain of successive users. Every user of the name acquired it from another user, who acquired it in turn from someone else, and so on, up to the first user who introduced the name to refer to a specific individual. Now, it seems to me that you remove the word causal from this description, and what you're left with is a picture that emphasizes the role of the reliance on one's linguistic community in one's use of names. A picture with a social flavor also highlighted by Kripke. Kripke says, in general, our reference depends not just on what we think ourselves, but on other people in the community. Now, you might as well call this picture the social network picture of reference, and contrast it with classical descriptivism, a view that contemplates the possibility that, as Kripke says, and this is a quote from Naming a Necessity, some man really gives a name by going into the privacy of his room and saying that the referent is to be the unique thing with certain identifying properties. Now, given the individualistic nature of descriptivism, it's not clear why we should expect East Asians to be inclined towards it. Following Chu, Nisbet states also the following. Those are results by Chu. The Chinese child learns very early to view the world as based on a network of relationships. He's socio-centered or situation-centered. And he also highlights that Asian culture is relatively collectivistic and interdependent, whereas ancient and contemporary Western culture is relatively individualistic and independent. Now, I don't know whether the results are right or wrong, but that is what they report. So it's not clear, when you think of this, it's not clear why Machery and colleagues hypothesize that East Asians should be more inclined towards descriptivism, and an essentially individualistic picture, and Westerners more inclined towards the Kripke-Donnellan account, a socially oriented picture. If we think about what each of the theories postulate, it seems that the natural hypothesis should have been just the opposite. Now, there's a second reason to be puzzled about the connection between psychologists, cross-cultural studies, and Machery and colleagues' hypothesis that Westerners are more inclined towards the causal historical picture. Now, the motivation provided for Machery and colleagues' hypothesis is the allegedly established conclusion, and I'm quoting here from Machery and colleagues' paper, that Westerners are more likely than East Asians to make causation-based judgments. But the conclusions of psychologists working in this area do not seem to support the claim that East Asians are any less inclined than Westerners to make causation-based judgments. For instance, this is a quote from Nisbet's, a paper that in 2001. He says, "It seems reasonable," after he has seen the differences, some cultural differences between Chinese and Westerners, he says, and he has seen this difference about the tendency towards looking more towards the field, interconnectedness, and a tendency in Westerners to look more at individual things that stand out and so on. After they have observed that, Nisbet says, "It seems reasonable to assume that people attribute causality to the events they attend to. If Westerners attend to the object, we would expect them to attribute causality to the object. If East Asians attend to the field and the object's relations with the field, it seems likely that they would be more inclined to attribute causality to context and situations." And then they say, each of those expectations is supported by a substantial amount of evidence. And then he goes on to explain what the evidence is. So, and in Choi and Alter, a study that focuses precisely on the differences between East Asians and Westerners as regards causation judgments, we read the following. They say, Aristotelian physics accounted for the behavior of objects by sole reference to the object's attributes. Not until the time of Galileo was it understood that the behavior of objects is the result of an interaction between the object and the environment. The contrast between object focus in the West and context focus in the East may underlie different thinking styles held to characterize the two cultures, namely analytic versus holistic. Westerners are held to be analytic, paying attention primarily to the object, categorizing it on the basis of its attributes, and attributing causality to the object based on rules about its category memberships. In contrast, East Asians are held to perceive and reason holistically, attending to the field in which objects are embedded and attributing causality to interactions between the object and the field. Now, in fact, in a piece that Machery and colleagues cite, right next to their claim that Westerners are more disposed to focus on causation in describing the world and classifying things, this is a piece that Machery quotes. Noren Zion, another cultural psychologist, concludes that East Asians have a more holistic sense of causality. They draw on a wider range of factors to explain events. Okay, now, the lesson to be drawn, it seems to me, from cross-cultural studies by psychologists is not that a group has a tendency towards causal explanations and another group does not have such a tendency, namely that Westerners focus on causation and East Asians are less disposed to do so. The issue, it appears, has to do rather with a difference as regards what East Asians and Westerners focus on when they attribute causality and when they make causal judgments. Westerners tend to focus on things apart from their context, perhaps another symptom of individualism, while East Asians focus on the whole field. Now, if I understand it, both groups give causal explanations, but they differ in what they see as the source of causal power and the terms of the causal relations. Thus, it's not clear either why Machery and colleagues postulated that East Asians would be any less inclined than Westerners to give or accept causal explanations. Let me make an aside here, something is entirely unrelated, but yesterday when Slobodan was presenting his talk and was talking about the kinds of explanations that seem acceptable. And it made me wonder whether there is some cultural difference there also. I mean, the idea, this idea of attributing causal powers to objects given the kinds they belong to, versus attributing causal powers to a whole field and its interactions. It would be interesting, it seemed to me, to explore whether there is a difference there in what seems acceptable and not acceptable to East Asians and Westerners. But anyway, that's related to cultural psychology. But as you can see, it's a puzzle to me why Masheri and colleagues postulated what they postulated. But nevertheless, their hypothesis is what it was. And the results appear to confirm it. So let's see whether they actually do. Let's put aside the questions about why they hypothesized it and then go to the actual results. Okay, as I said, there was a first test. Now, to test their hypothesis, Masheri and colleagues collected data from two sets of subjects. Westerners in the US and East Asians in Hong Kong, presenting them to them stories modeled on Kripke's Gödel case, which is one of the examples used by Kripke to illustrate the error argument. I'll read it very quickly. The idea is that that's what they gave the subject. Suppose that John has learned in college that Gödel is the man who proved an important mathematical theorem called incompleteness of arithmetic, but this is the only thing that he has heard about Gödel. Now suppose that Gödel was not the author of this theorem. Never mind that they use Gödel in the story, causally, historically, but anyway, let's put it aside. Now suppose that Gödel was not the author of this theorem. A man called Schmidt, whose body was found in Vienna under mysterious circumstances many years ago, actually did the work in question. His friend Gödel somehow got hold of the manuscript and claimed credit for the work. Thus, he has been known as the man who proved the incompleteness of arithmetic. Most people who have heard the name Gödel are like John. The claim that Gödel discovered the incompleteness theorem is the only thing they have heard about Gödel. And now, they gave the subjects in the US and in Hong Kong this story, and then they asked them the following questions. When John uses the name Gödel, is he talking about option A, the person who really discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic? Option B, the person who got hold of the manuscript and claimed credit for the work. Now observe that option A is the answer that goes along the descriptivist prediction. Right? It's whoever satisfies the description that is attached to the name. The description attached to the name is the man who proved the incompleteness of arithmetic. B, now observe something really curious is that B is another description. Right? But the response would go in line with the causal historical picture, right? It's the man who stole it, but it's the man that would have been called B. Okay, so what happens? Most Westerners chose B, whereas most East Asians chose A. And so they concluded that East Asians, unlike Westerners, report intuitions that are more consistent with descriptivism. And they concluded that these results constitute prima facie evidence that semantic intuitions vary from culture to culture, a fact that raises questions about the nature of the philosophical enterprise of developing a theory of reference. Now, there have been different reactions to these results. Kirk Ludwig has pointed out, rightly, it seems to me, that the test doesn't manage to distinguish whether this is a semantic or a pragmatic phenomenon. Barry Lamb reports that, makes us notice that the test was given in English to people in Hong Kong who were fluent in English, but nevertheless that's the second language. And he claims that when he gave a similar test in Cantonese, he got opposite results. I don't want to rely too much on Barry Lamb's results because I confess that his test is very different. When you read the story, the test is very different from Masheri, so I don't think that it really opposes. But anyway, now my take on this issue is entirely different. It seems to me that the responses that they obtain in that probe do not show that the semantic intuitions that are relevant in the enterprise of developing a theory of reference vary from culture to culture. The intuitions that they elicit are just not relevant data for the construction of a theory of reference. Now, we need to distinguish two kinds of data, two kinds of possible findings, and the subsequent impact on semantics. Suppose that we find evidence that some people use the name Gödel descriptively, I don't want to imagine how we would find it, but suppose that we find evidence that convinces that a group of people is using the name Gödel descriptively. Now, that would be a semantically interesting result. Undeniably, a result that would invite semanticists to think about the level of universality or locality of their claims about types of expressions and the rules of use. Now, a different issue, of course, is whether it would refute Kripke and Donlan. Kripke and Donlan offer a theory about how a certain kind of expression functions. Theirs is not a theory that predicts that all speakers' communities have that kind of expression incorporated in their practices. So some semanticists may want to argue that were we to find a community of speakers that used expressions such as Gödel, Aristotle, or Feynman descriptively, we would have found a community that did not really have names in their language, even though they use expressions that look a lot like names in other languages like English, French, Italian, or Spanish. Now, in any case, the point is that this is not the kind of evidence that Machery and colleagues are eliciting. Now, the question that they ask does not give the semanticist input about how the subjects and their community of speakers use the expression Gödel. The question invites the participants to think about how a hypothetical speaker, John, uses a name. It prompts them to reflect on someone, supposedly someone in their own community, on someone's name-using practices and on how they think that reference is determined. So at most, this gives the semanticist, I think, information about the kind of theory of reference that the subjects would find more natural, namely a theory that predicted that the referent of Gödel is the person who satisfies some description. Now, this is interesting to know, but it's not the kind of data that is relevant to the semanticist. The semanticist needs to reflect on how speakers use expressions. She does not need to reflect on how people think they use expressions, and in particular how they think reference is determined. But the latter is what Machery and colleagues' test provides. Asking the participants in the experiment whether John talks about or refers to one or another of two people when he uses Gödel invites them to reflect on how, in their opinion, reference is determined. And this just tests opinions as regards which way of thinking, namely theorizing about reference determination, is correct. Machery's probe is not meant to provide data about the use of an expression. It provides data about how participants think an expression is used, and that is already in the path of theorizing, a task that corresponds to the semanticist. I granted that they do not ask something as blunt as, which theory of reference do you think gives the right prediction? Right? But the data they collect, namely beliefs about who a hypothetical speaker refers to when using a certain expression, are one step removed from the kind of data about use that semanticists rely on. All right. So we don't have any guarantee that people's judgment about how an expression in their speaker's community is used and the judgment of how they themselves use it will reflect how they, in fact, do use the expression. Plenty of evidence would seem to suggest that there are, in all kinds of matters, wide differences between how people do things and how they think they do them, between the principles that they think guide their practice and the principles that in fact do so. And experiments whose results depend on reflection on the subject's own professed beliefs are good illustrations, as we seem to be notoriously poor judges of our own mental states and biases. For instance, in a recent study by Kelly and Redder, they used fake resumes presented with black-sounding names, such as Jamal and Lakeisha, versus white-sounding names, such as Emily and Gregory. Now, the number of prospective employers called back to pursue the application were significantly higher for the latter set of resumes than for the former. A systematic result observed in all job scales, didn't matter whether it was CEO or janitor, and all commercial activities. So, and this is among people who had also responded tests about racial biases, and the test directly about racial biases where like they came, you know, with flying colors, obviously. But anyway, now in the case at hand, we simply cannot assume that the subject's responses to Macherie's question reflect how they in fact use names. That's my concern. And that's the evidence that the semanticist needs to draw conclusions that may have an impact in the theory of reference. Okay, and that's the argument that I made in this paper that was published in Analysis in 2009. Now, this point about the divergence between eliciting data about subject's usage and eliciting data about the subject's judgment about usage was taken seriously by Machery, and it was subsequently addressed in that paper by Machery, Olivola, and de Blanc. Now, they distinguish, in this new paper, which appeared in Analysis in 2009, they distinguish between what they call linguistic intuitions and meta-linguistic intuitions. Let me say that I never made this distinction, and this is somehow is going to become important. Now, the latter being, they think that the latter, the metalinguistic ones, are the kinds of intuitions that they elicited in their first study, and that they object to that. Now, this is a quote from their paper. They say, Genoveva Marti argues that the type of intuitions examined by Machery and colleagues, metalinguistic intuitions, is evidentially irrelevant for identifying the correct theory of reference. And she concludes that the variation in the relevant intuitions about reference within and across cultures has not been established. Marti is certainly right to draw a distinction between these two types of intuitions, but her conclusion is too hasty, for it presupposes that people's metalinguistic intuitions are not in agreement with their linguistic intuitions. Suppose, for instance, that people judge that in Krupke's Gödel case, Gödel refers to the individual originally called Gödel, and that they say that Gödel should not have claimed credit for the incompleteness theorem. Now, their metalinguistic and linguistic intuitions in the Gödel case would be congruent. So the structure of their second probe and their second study is to try to show that whatever people say when they reflect about how a hypothetical speaker uses expressions is in line with the way in which they use the expression themselves. Now, if that is correct, then my concerns are put to rest. Now, in my paper, I had suggested, in my original paper, I had suggested that the question that they asked in the 2004 probe should have prompted subjects in the experiment to use the name Gödel. So my proposal was the following. I was telling them, look, why don't you end the Gödel story as follows? Just tell them, one day the fraud is exposed. And John exclaims, today is a sad day. We have found out that Gödel was a thief and a liar. Now, what do you think about John's reaction? Ask people that. Make them write a paragraph in which they use the word Gödel. Let's see what they say. Let's see if they say, oh, Professor Gödel, we are now so happy because now we know who you are. Okay? Or whether they say, Professor Gödel, how could you do that? I admired you. Then it will give you a clear idea as to whether they think that when they use Gödel, they're referring to the guy who actually discovered the theorem and proved the theorem, or they're actually thinking about the guy who just stole it. But let them use it. Let's see what happens. Okay, that was my idea. My idea was in responding to the question, subjects would be using Gödel to say something about an individual, and their sentence might give us, the sentences might give us evidence for whether they were talking about the satisfier of the description or the individual at the end of a chain of communication. Now, they don't use this kind of question in the new probe. They said that they don't use it because open questions such as, what do you think of John's reaction, do not yield easily analyzable data. I mean, what they don't yield is easily quantifiable data, but that's a different story, right? Anyway, so instead they use one of the stories used in the Machery, in the original Machery paper. They used, in that paper they were using the Gödel case, but they were using other cases also. And that story involves Su Chung Chi, the discoverer of the precise time of the solstices, and a hypothetical user called Ivy, which mutatis mutandis is exactly like the Gödel case, and I think that you can imagine how the story goes, and I won't torture you repeating it, okay? Now, so remember, now they're going to ask two different kinds of questions, a meta-linguistic question and a linguistic question. Now, the meta-linguistic question is the mirror image of the question asked in the first paper. Namely, when Ivy uses the name Su Chung Chi, who do you think she's actually talking about? A, the person who really determined the solstice times, descriptivist answer. B, the person who is believed to have discovered the solstice times but actually stole this discovery and claimed credit for it. That's the causal, in line with causal historical. All right. Now, on the other hand, the linguistic question is the following. When Ivy says Su Chung Chi was a great astronomer, do you think that her claim is A, true, B, false? A would be the descriptivist view, right? Because whoever is the person who discovered the date of the solstices is a great astronomer. B would be the non-descriptive one. Now, they tested three different sets of subjects, and of course, for each set of subjects, they divided them in two. One group had the metalinguistic question, the other one had the linguistic question, and the subjects that they tested were in India, France, and Mongolia. I've asked several times why they didn't test again in Hong Kong and in the United States. Never received an answer. But let me just show what the results were. So these were the results. In India, in Mongolia, and in France. Now, this gives the percentage of causal historical answers for each one of the questions. Now, in India, for the metalinguistic question, remember the metalinguistic question is the question that is like the one that they had asked before, right? Who is you referring to? So you're reflecting. They got 58% of Kripkean judgments. That's the answer. And for the linguistic question, they got 67%. So this is the metalinguistic, and this is the linguistic, as they call it. In Mongolia, they got very similar results. 56% in the metalinguistic, and 66% in the linguistic. And in France, they got 48% Kripkeans on the metalinguistic, and 56% in the linguistic. Okay? All right, so what happened here? Several things to say about that. Although observe that there is a tendency in all the groups towards the causal historical picture in answers to the linguistic question, the question about is it true or is it false, right? But they observe that the difference is small and never reaches significance. I mean, the chi just falls in the non-significant side of the equation. And they conclude that there is no significant difference in the subject's inclinations to give Kripkean responses to the metalinguistic and the linguistic questions. Now, what this is supposed to show is, and I quote from them, people's intuitions about what proper names refer to in counterfactual cases seem to be in sync with the way they use these proper names to make judgments about the characters described in these cases. And thus, the subject's judgment about how a name is used to refer does reflect how they themselves, in fact, use it. So that was the original idea. Let's just try to see if the way in which they use it goes along the way in which they judge that it's being used. All right. Well, okay. I have serious methodological concerns about that. There is something that perhaps in the discussion will come up, but I can give you some information about the sizes of the samples, which to me is just methodologically should erase the value of this. But in spite of that, I mean, I'm not an experimentalist. I want to proceed giving them the methodology. Now, but observe that if this is the right conclusion to my concerns, then the concerns can be laid to rest, because there is no appreciable difference between the subject's de facto real usage, if they're right, and the results of the reflection about usage. So they say that this finding considerably blunts Marti's criticism of Machery and colleagues' cross-cultural findings, since it's unclear on what grounds we will grant linguistic and metalinguistic intuitions a different evidential value. All right. Now, there are a few things that we may observe about this. I just want you to notice one thing that is really curious, is that there was supposed to be a cross-cultural difference established between the way in which East Asians and Westerners use names. Have you noticed that the French are the most descriptivists of the lot? And the last time I checked, they were not East Asians, right? So this is very curious in any way. But what I mean is that there is a sense in which I don't want to criticize them for that, even though it seems to me that they are extremely criticizable, because the structure of their argument is the following, right? We have established a cross-cultural difference using this question. Now we're establishing that there's no appreciable difference between one question and the other. Now we can go back to our original study and say, had we asked this question to the East Asians and to the Westerners, we would have gotten similar results. That's the argument, okay? All right, no problem, that's fine. Well, many problems, but still. All right, let me say what really my point is about this, that putting aside all my concerns about the new probe, I will say that my concerns are still the same that I had with the first probe, exactly the same. I mean, in fact, David Chalmers also expressed them, and he encapsulated them in a short sentence. There was a blog for a while that in the experimental philosophy, there was a thread in the experimental philosophy blog with the title, "Did Marti Refute the Cross-Cultural Results of Machery's Study?" And there was a lot of discussion whether my concerns were refuted or not. And then they presented the paper. And David Chalmers just wrote this. It was one of the first entries in the blog. He said, "Both the use case and the metalinguistic case are metalinguistic, testing subjects' intuitions about others' uses of names." See, for the longest time, people were telling me, you need to answer this, you need to publish an answer to this thing, to this study by Machery. And I just was telling them, you know, I mean, David Chalmers already answered, and it was one sentence and not even analysis. We'll accept a paper this short. So, anyway. Now, see, the core of my criticism in the 2009 paper is not that the question asked is a metalinguistic question. I mean, I don't care about the question. What I care is about the data, the responses that it elicits. The point is that the participants' responses do not provide data about their use of Gödel, which would be the relevant thing to try to find out. And that's the kind of data that we need. And the question that I was proposing is meant to elicit responses in which subjects use Gödel, and it does not ask subjects to reflect on someone's use of Gödel. And their question continues to do that. Now, there's one thing that I want to say. The question that they label as linguistic is certainly different from the original question, the one that they label as metalinguistic, because it asks them to think about truth or falsity. So in a sense, it's testing their intuitions about truth and falsity. And I don't want to deny that it's that competent speakers of a language, by and large, share intuitions about the truth conditions of the sentences that they use. I mean, it wouldn't occur to me to deny that. It seems to me that communication would break down if we didn't share those intuitions. But one thing is to have certain intuitions about what makes a sentence true or false, and another thing is to be able to verbalize them and to reflect about them. And that's what they are requiring, and I don't think that this is going anywhere. All right, so the question now is, and okay, I have 2 minutes now, right?
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. The question is, so I'm saying that the semanticist looks at the use and comes up with a theory, and this theory has to be tested against people's use of expressions. Let me just say that saying that I'm not committing myself to the view that semantics is just a descriptive articulation of actual practice. Because there is a difference between the actions and individual and collective intentions that give rise to an institution and the institution itself. And so the study of language, which is an institution and its mode of operation, is different, I think, from the study of the actions and intentions of the speakers that give rise to the institution. So I'm not just thinking of, when I say that we have to be very sensitive to the use, I'm not just saying that all we're doing as semanticist is just describe statistically the use or something like that. Now, what they are asking in both probes for the subjects to do is that job of looking at the use and begin to answer the first theoretical question semanticists ask themselves. Now, let me just say also that I'm not against the use of tests in lab conditions, and there may be cases in which observation of practice is insufficient to give us all the data that we need, that we really do need in order to in order to construct a semantic theory. But those vignettes should be better designed, and they should collect data about use. Now, but how to do that? The question now is, okay, whatever is useful data is welcome, whether it comes from observation or it comes from probes. But there's a question here. If Machery and colleagues are not collecting the right data, should we now design different probes? Should we just like go ahead and do it? No? I must say that, although I'm not opposed to the doing probes for some phenomena, linguistic phenomena, I do not think that a radical change in our methods is called for. Let me say this. I mean, Kripke and Donnellan are competent speakers, and they are part of a community, and they reflect on the use of language. They have already made the observations that are relevant to semantic theory. The semanticist method is no less scientific because the collection of data does not happen in a lab. The task of observing the behavior and interaction among speakers that can provide relevant data for semantics is more similar to participant observation, a method traditionally used in social psychology and in anthropology. Participant observation is characterized as a qualitative research method, and the data collected may not always be easily analyzable. But it seems to me that it's not clear that it's any less scientific if it's conducted from the point of view of a theory that one is trying to test. Now, the semanticist is part of a community, and at the same time an observer, capable of being fully embedded in the practices of the community and capable of maintaining the kind of distance required to reflect on those practices. So the semanticist, when doing semantic theory, is a little bit like the proverbial Martian anthropologist that David Kaplan was talking about, right? Martian because it keeps the distance, right? Now, the semanticist already has and legitimately employs data about use. Semanticists, like the philosophers that Alfred Jules Ayer describes in The Problems of Knowledge, this is a quote from Ayer, are in the strange position that all the evidence which bears upon their problems is already available to them. Now, It's perhaps too optimistic to think that all the data required for semantic theorizing is already at our disposal, and as I have suggested, new data coming from new probes, if those probes are well designed and they collect data about ordinary usage, may be a welcome addition. But we should not think that semanticists have been working so far in a vacuum without paying attention to relevant observations. So semanticists, I think, do not have to get out of the armchair. They already are. They have always been out of the armchair. Thank you.
Genoveva, I have two comments. No, one is a question actually. But the comment is all this idea that, in the Western world people care much more on causal explanation than on the Eastern world. That would rule out 90% of the history of philosophy in the Western world. When you go to the human world, people traditionally didn't care much about causation.
In the Western world?
Yeah, even in the West. I don't know about the Eastern world. Certainly in the Western world. So,
right.
Take Wittgenstein. Certainly he wasn't so crazy about causation when he was talking about reasons, and so many others. So that's, I don't know exactly who they are testing, perhaps. When we take students, perhaps they are engineers. I don't think they are representatives of anything specific. The other question is about the math of this experiment that I don't really understand. If you look at the gap within the groups, right? So they say, for example, take the Indian group. There is a gap of 9% between the metalinguistic and the linguistic. They say 9%, okay. This
is not significant.
It's not significant. Then you go to comparing groups. Take the French and the Mongolians. It's 4% of the linguistic level. 4%. And this is relevant. This is an experiment on linguistic intuitions, right? Now, 4% would prove what? Look, there is more distance between the Indian and the Mongolians than between the Mongolians and the French. If you have to make two groups, one would be the Indians, and the other one would be the Mongolians and the French, as to the linguistic intuition, right?
No, sorry, this is a 6.
Which is a 6?
This is a 10%.
6 is 6. Okay. Still, it's much less than it's 10%.
But here you have an 8% difference, here you have a 10%.
Okay. But now, take
here you have a 9.
So 9% wasn't relevant. But now 10% between the French and the Mongolians is relevant. You say, oh, there is a big difference there.
Right.
That's strange, right?
See, well, the thing, let me just say what I want to say about them. Because this is something that I have never used, but it's something that has been bothering me. First of all, in the paper in analysis, they give you the sizes of the samples. And the sizes of the samples, if I recall, I'm sorry that I left my computer in the hotel, but if I make a mistake, it will be a mistake of 1 or 2. But in the Indian, I think that there are 83 people. In the Mongolians, there are like 77, and in the French, I think that there are 66. Okay, now, first thing is that one of the things that any psychologist will tell you is that when you see these kinds of differences, and remember, this is divided in 2, right?
Yes, it's very small groups.
Okay. One of the things that any psychologist will tell you, and I know that because I've asked psychologists, I went with this test to the director of the Cultural and Social Psychology lab at Rochester University, which is a woman that I know, and I showed her, and she was just like, well, she didn't climb the walls because, one of the first things is that when you see these kinds of differences and they are not significant, but you see a tendency, the first thing that you do is try a larger sample to see, because something that is not significant with a certain amount of a sample may become significant if the tendency persists. So the first thing to do with this, which is something that if philosophers are supposed to import psychologists' methods, one of the things is that there's something about the methods that we also should import, and in that usually they run many experiments about the same thing. Not just, you don't have one paper published for each experiment. Right? So the first thing is that more of this, once you have observed the tendency, more of this should have been run. And now let me tell you the thing that really, really bothers me.
They're all students, probably?
They're students. No. These were not, sorry. The first test was students. The first test was a bunch of students in Rutgers, non-philosophers, and they excluded people who had Asian ancestry, and then a bunch of students in Hong Kong, non-philosophers also.
But these are not just.
No, because the ages here are, there are people that are 70, so it's a much the age sample is, and the male-female ratio is more or less the same and so on. The thing that really bothers me is that when they, let me put it like this. They give me these numbers in the published paper, but I received the paper that was before this paper was published in Analysis. It was read. It was refereed, accepted, and read at a meeting of the Society for Philosophy and Psychology that was held in the United States, and I have the draft. So that was, but that was, it's not published, but that was given as a draft to referees and so on. And there's something that appears there, and it does not appear in the published paper. And that is the split in groups. Who received, how many people received the metalinguistic question, and how many people received the linguistic question? Let me tell you this. And here, now I don't have the exact numbers. There's one number that I have exact, but if I make a mistake, it will be, I think that there were like 40, 43. Here they were like 37, 40. I don't remember those very well, but this one I remember very well. 50 received the metalinguistic question, and 16 received the linguistic question. So my concern, that I have two concerns here. One concern is not so much with the sizes of the sample, but with the proportion, with the comparative proportion of the samples. Because one mistake among 16, one person just makes a mistake and just puts the cross where they don't intend to. Among 16 is very different from one mistake among 50. And you know, I'm a layman. I don't do statistics, but I can see that, right? So that's one thing that bothers me. But the other thing that bothers me is different. Is why isn't this in the published paper?
Yeah, that's okay.
That's a different kind of concern, but that concerns me.
Not the psychology.
That concerns me really seriously because all this data has to be disclosed.
Even reading the data, isn't 10% not very much to say that there are big cultural differences?
Well,
10%.
Observe that here they don't want to establish any cultural result, right? The structure. Because just because they get the contrary. But the thing is that the structure is we're not testing for this here. Here we're testing for whether the use goes hand in hand with the reflection of abuse. Now, and my only concern, the only thing that I focus on, I mean, as you see, I finally wrote a paper, and then what happened is, it was so long that it just couldn't fit in Analysis because it was over 8,000 words, so it's coming out somewhere else. But the point is this one, that the only thing that I have focused on is just I keep just sticking to my guns. I mean, it's the same concern that I had before. You are not testing. Here you're not giving us any result that will allow us to establish that the reflection about use goes hand in hand with use, because this is not about use. This is still reflection on how whether a sentence is true or false as used by a member of your community. And what I want you to do is just do something like what I propose, or tell people, Professor Gödel is in the next room. Go and tell him something. Or there have been people who have suggested use photographs or something like that, but let people act. Right? That's what we really need. It's like if you want to get evidence about how people reason, don't ask them which principle of reasoning you think is correct, because everybody will tell you that modus ponens is correct, and then they will go and they will not apply it. Okay.
Yes.
One more question.
Just a brief comment. I mean, I agree. It's a really excellent idea. I think that what you suggested methodologically, what should be done. I mean, one way is to combine two kinds of studies and, you know, compare the notes. And now I feel really sorry because the initial idea was to invite Edward as well.
Edward?
Actually, yeah.
Oh, that would have been a lot of fun.
That would be very fun.
Then I would have asked him, tell me this, because I asked you once, and you never responded.
I mean,
he's a very nice guy. He's a very nice guy. He probably would have said,
his defense,
I
mean, psychological studies look like this all the time.
I must say that I agree
yeah,
with you.
I mean, they had, what, 250 subjects in 3 different countries, you know, that's a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
And I mean, they probably were a little bit defensive, I guess, that they didn't publish all these results, I mean, the distribution.
Yeah.
If it was a psychology journal, they probably would have done it because, you know, psychologists
They
know.
No.
They know it's kind of...
You're right about one thing. So, some psychologists that I have asked, they tell me, oh, no, doesn't matter. Whatever you get 16, you get it with 116. Yes. Excuse me. Don't tell me this. But you're right about that this happens. And let me just only stress another thing about the methodology. I'm not against doing these kinds of probes. In fact, I have a student who's a psychologist and who's interested. He's writing a dissertation, finishing in fact, and she's interested in some claims that philosophers have made about the contextuality of belief reporting. You know, this idea that, for instance, if everybody in the United States uses the word Cicero and everybody in the United Kingdom uses the word Tully, then if I want to report your belief in the United States, I will say that you believe that Cicero was a great orator. But if I go to the United Kingdom, I will probably say that you believe that Tully is a great orator. Whereas in the United States, with you around, and maybe you telling me, Tully? Who's Tully? I don't know who Tully is. I wouldn't report it, right? So the idea is that we adjust in context. But many philosophers have said that. Mark Richard has a contextualist theory. Perry and Clemens have a contextualist theory. Westing has a contextualist theory. Lepore and Kaplan have a contextualist theory about saying. Same saying is also contextual. Okay, that's very interesting. But what kind of evidence do we have that people actually do that? Right? And I think that you collect the evidence. The evidence exists, but somehow it may not be. It's not just what evidence do we have, but which parameters are relevant. Is the familiarity that people have with the word? Is the fact that the stakes may be higher? Like if you're around and you can say, Tully? Who's Tully? What are you telling about me and Tully? Right? Is the fact that the stakes are higher? So all these are parameters that may be important, and it's more difficult to just go around because you don't have that much evidence. And she has been writing vignettes and passing them around to students in different departments and collecting evidence. I recognize one thing, it's very difficult also to write a good vignette. Right? I mean, some of the things that she wrote at the beginning, after she did the study and she got the results, I just immediately, you know, it's only after you see the results that you say, oh, wait a second, you've got this result, but this could be because of this and this and that. So, I mean, it is difficult, but I think that they could do a better job. Okay, thanks.